Welcome to Commander Central, episode 251, and today, in honor of breaking the quarter millennial mark, I guess it would be, we will continue to take questions from listeners like you. I'm Dana.
I'm Max.
And I'm Chris.
Good afternoon, friends. How's it going?
It is a wonderful day in the neighborhood.
It's a wonderful day in the neighborhood. Wonderful day in the neighborhood. Thanks. That's going to be in my head all day.
It's relatively bright and sunny, and it's relatively nice and warm, so I will absolutely take it. I took my dog for a little walk shortly before this, and she flopped down in the grass in front of my house, so I just went and grabbed the chair from my garage and sat next to her in the sun for about 15 minutes, and man, that just felt really good.
Oh, I believe it. I do have a qualm or an argument or a hatred right now for the city that we live in.
Okay.
Who in their right mind runs street sweepers up and down the road at midnight repeatedly? I don't know what they were doing, but there was just city trucks going up and down and then sweepers going by, and I'm like, you guys are lucky I'm not sleeping right now. That's all I got to say. Otherwise, I'd be coming out here, my skivvies yelling at you. Go away!
That seems like a terrible time for that. Yeah.
I don't know what was going on. I was just like, well, that's awesome. You guys are sleeping. That means it's spring and all that. But yeah, don't you know people need to sleep?
Well, so a few years back, this was quite a few years back, at my work, we had some visiting executive in town for a week, and she was staying at a hotel not far from our office, and sent an email to our office manager the next morning asking her if she could do something about the city snowplows coming through at like 2 a.m. that woke her up. And I just remember the office manager telling me about this email and me like trying to mentally unpack all the layers involved in that. Number one, that our office manager had the power to get the city to change their plowing schedule. Seems like a really strange thing to believe that could be controlled. Number two, that the city would not plow snow blocking the roads for one person being disturbed by it in a hotel. There was just so many questions I had about why someone would write that email and think that made sense in the first place.
Yeah, snow's one thing. I mean, plow away, guys. That doesn't even bother me. Like when
street sweepers, yeah, that's a different story.
When I lived in the apartment years ago, you know, we'd have the guy come out and plow at like 2 o'clock in the morning, like the apartment. I'm like, oh, it doesn't even bother me. You're getting rid of the snow so I don't have to mess with it in the morning. Thank you.
Yeah, at least that, like, you're like, it's the sound of me not having to do work.
Yep.
That's what that is. So we did get some official information this week. Nothing like earth-shattering, just some confirmations of dates and that kind of thing. So Strixhaven, April 23rd, which we knew. Modern Horizons 2, June 11th, which we knew. D&D Forgotten Realms, June 16th, which I don't know if we knew that exact date, but we knew roughly July.
Oh, wow. That's not even a week later?
A month later. So June 11th to July 16th.
Okay.
Innistrad, however, was a question. We knew there was going to be 2 sets. We knew one was werewolf and vampire themed, but we didn't know what the release order was, how that was going to break down. So we did get official word on that. The first set is called Innistrad Midnight Hunt, and that is the werewolf-based one, and that's all we really got was that it's a werewolf-based set, which we already knew. That's going to be September 17th, which is the traditional fall slot as well, end of September. The second one, however, is Innistrad Crimson Vow. That's the vampire set, and we didn't know the name of that. That's November 19th, so essentially we have another standard set basically coming out in November in the slot, where traditionally we've got things like Commander Legends or a master set in the past. So we're basically getting an additional standard set this year, and the one note they dropped about that is it's going to be themed around a vampire wedding on Innistrad. So there's been a lot of speculation about what that all entails, but that's what we know.
Is that Soren and was it Olivia or whatever? Are they getting married? Are they going to combine their clans?
Yeah. Maybe this is my chance for the Baron Sanger to come through the portal and marry somebody. I don't know.
Right?
That's
he comes in just long enough to be the pastor or whatnot.
To get married. Yeah. So anyway, we have one additional standard set this year, and that's going to be showing up in November. And there's always been kind of a weird hole there where they usually said they've plugged in master sets or whatever in the past. So I guess if you're a standard player, maybe that keeps things interesting for you to not have that like
aren't they
5-month
small sets though?
There.
Both those sets, I thought they were going to be smaller than an actual like large like 250 card set because there were 2 separate themes to them.
Yeah, I don't know, actually, and I don't think they actually said in the release. Maybe they are somewhat smaller sets, kind of like we used to get with that, what was oftentimes the middle set of a three block set. They didn't specify, so I don't know if they're smaller or they're going to be like just standard size, I guess. Okay. We'll see.
And then the actual Commander product, our 5 usual decks are coming out in November too, aren't they?
No, that is with Strixhaven. So like in 3 weeks. And they haven't given us much information on that. Yeah.
That's why, because I was looking at stuff today too. I was like, oh, what are new spoilers? And I didn't see anything about Commander. So I'm like, oh, it must be in the fall then.
They've been really silent about it, but we're getting all 5 of the decks like we usually do. Very similar to how we got the ones last year with Ikoria. And they will be themed off of Strixhaven as well. And some of the speculation I've seen, because it was revealed that the 5 magic schools in Strixhaven were founded by like 5 different dragons. So the speculation is, because the 5 decks are also going to be enemy colored, that the face card will be each of the 5 dragons from the Strixhaven schools. So yeah, we'll get those 5, and we're also going to continue to get, I believe, 2 decks with every standard expansion as well. So like we'll get 2 with Forgotten Realms, we'll get the 2 with, I'm assuming, both Innistrad expansions as well. So, which I like. Like that's way better than getting the Planeswalker decks that no one used to play, or kind of those intro decks we used to get years ago that were good for the face card, and that was about it.
We actually had someone come into the store the other day asking for one of the starter decks.
Oh, really? Like one of the older ones?
Yeah. Well, because she was looking for like a mono red starter deck. And I was like,
oh, sure.
People usually don't buy these, so we don't have any.
I think that's where like Krenko was originally. He was in one of those, I think.
Yeah, he was.
Well, I'm excited about that. I'm definitely going to be picking up all the Commander decks this time because, I haven't been, and I had been buying singles, and now these singles are getting outrageously expensive, so I'm just going to buy all the decks.
I mean, like, realistically, those Commander decks, at what you pay for them, within 3 or 4 years, there's almost always one card in those decks worth the cost of the whole deck.
Well, nowadays, it's like within the first 2 months, one of the cards
right, sometimes,
like
yeah. So yeah, I will probably do the same thing. So, okay, if you out there in listener land want to reach out to us and talk about anything interesting in your life or in the world of Magic, or tell us your thoughts on the upcoming Magic schedule, how would you go about doing that, Chris?
Well, you can reach us on a multitude of social media platforms. You can find us on Twitter at CMDR Central. You can find us on Facebook by searching CMDR Central. You can find us online at cmdrcentral.com, and you can also find us on YouTube by searching CMDR Central.
You can also head over to patreon.com/CMDR Central and check out our reward tiers, such as the Dexy Play shows, guesting on our show, or just joining our community and chatting with us and playing some virtual EDH. This week we want to say hello and thank you to 2 new patrons. We'd like to say hello and thank you to Hunter Aro and Justin Kulsi Estes. Yeah, totally screwed that one up. So sorry about that.
It's taken a while since you've gotten one, and I've loved it now.
And I'm glad I wasn't asked to do that, because I actually have both their names written down in front of me on envelopes that I filled out this morning that I haven't put in the mail yet. So,
speaking of envelopes, Dana.
Yes.
So, this is a shout out to one of our Patreon supporters, Craig DeBivic. We had him, hosted him on a show recently, and he's a local person who lives around us. So we sent out playmats and all that. Dana did this, and Dana told me that he was just going to go drop it off at Craig's house. Well, I talked to Craig yesterday, and Craig said, did one of you guys come over to my house and put something in my mailbox? And I was like, well, yeah, I told him the whole story, that the talk that we had, Dana. And he's like, I didn't know what it was. He's like, I sat on my front porch, opened it, pointing away from me because I thought it was a glitter bomb. He's like, I didn't know what was going on. Because there was no name on it, nothing, he just he didn't know what it was.
Well, so I went to the post office. It was like 9 a.m. too. And the funny thing is, like, he's probably closer to the post office than I am. So I'm like, I'm certainly not going to mail this. I just went to his house and found his house and put it in his mailbox. And I would have knocked on his door, but it was like 9 a.m. And I'm like, who knows if someone's asleep? And particularly because I didn't know I was coming, I'm like, I'll just put it in the mailbox. That never occurred to me that he might think someone put a pipe bomb in my mailbox.
Yeah, he was just like, I thought it was a glitter bomb. I'm like, Craig, what kind of YouTube videos are you watching, man?
Who have you made angry lately, Craig?
Actually, I asked him, like, do you want us to give you a glitter bomb? He's like, no, do not do that.
Now that we know where he lives, that's a possibility.
I figured I'd share that story because I got a huge kick out of it yesterday.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Well, thank you to Craig, and thank you to all our patron supporters. It means a lot. We really do appreciate it. And we won't glitter bomb any of you.
Maybe.
So yeah, maybe. So thanks very much, everybody, patrons, supporters, and people that just listen and like and upvote. That means the world to us as well. So thanks, everybody.
Yes, thank you.
Should we jump here right into reading the questions that we have left here?
Let's rock and roll.
Sure thing.
All right. And Chris, I think you are up.
I am. And we will start off with this one from one Kevin Phillips. And Kevin asks, how did you guys find your LGS? He prerequisites this with saying that he doesn't have a local store that he likes to go to, and he doesn't really have a play group. He just plays with his brother and his wife, and he wants to find a good LGS to go play at. So I'm going to throw this out to you guys, because I actually know so much of the community that's really easy for me to find an LGS, but how would you guys go about doing this?
So Max just told this story recently on the Commander Crunch podcast, I believe, didn't you, Max?
I did go into our dark past of how we all kind of met each other and how we moved from LGS number 1 to LGS number 2 to LGS number 2.5 to LGS number 3.
So there's a couple ways we can answer this. The first thing is I'll answer what we did. There was gaming stores in town. And basically, when we wanted to play Commander at a store, this was myself and a coworker of mine who I started playing Commander with, just like 1v1. We got to the point where we wanted to find other people to play with, and nobody had a Commander night advertised or anything on their website for any of these stores in town. So we kind of just picked one and walked in, and it seemed, it was clean enough and everyone seemed friendly enough. So we just told the store owner, we're going to sit down and play Commander every Tuesday night. And he's like, okay, well, go right ahead. And after us showing up for, some weeks, he eventually advertised that people were there playing Commander on Tuesdays. And Max happened to come in, or I can't remember if you saw the advertisement or if you just happened to come in and we were playing sometime.
I saw the advertisement because I was playing with a buddy at his house, essentially doing the same thing you guys were doing.
And then Chris used to go to that store to do, I think, F&M kind of things, didn't you, Chris? Yep. And then you just wandered in when we were playing Commander. I believe the story you told was, why are those guys playing with giant decks?
Yeah, I was so confused because, I'm used to playing, standard or draft formats and stuff like that. And I'm like, there's something wrong here. I mean, we had something, I didn't know if someone was playing that card where if you have like 250 cards in your deck, you win the game or something. I was just like, what's going on?
Battle
yeah. So that's what we did. And if you are someone who has LGSs in your area, I would imagine number one nowadays, most of them do have a Commander night. If they don't, if you have one or two friends to play with, you could kind of start one the same way. I would imagine that would work as well. If you don't have stores in your area, or say you have one and you just don't like going there for whatever reason because, ownership is weird or something, you can just search local groups. I've seen people make posts before on area Facebook groups, looking for people for game nights for that kind of thing. Now, usually that's for things like wanting to play, Gloomhaven or whatever, looking for people to play that. But there's no reason you couldn't do the same thing with find local groups or things like Nextdoor or whatever if you don't have an LGS as an option.
Yeah.
But that's most people do, unless you're living way out in, some small town in a really rural area. There's probably a couple shops and they probably do have Commander nights. So I think it's a matter of just finding a shop that you're comfortable going to and trying out their Commander night. I think you just got to show up and see what happens, I think.
Yeah, because I know there's a couple of guys who come to our local Commander night now who are newer faces. I think one of them drives 2 hours to come.
Oh, geez. Yeah, I mean,
just because he has no other local area that's close by that actually plays Commander, that has a good group of people. So he drives that far just because there's so many people that show up to ours. So that's something you could look at, because I know for our local area, we have people from Rice Lake who come down to our area, which is an hour and a half drive, because there's nothing way up north. And they found all that information just by going on Facebook and looking up, Magic communities in my area, or Magic communities, in your said town. And then you get so many groups and stuff like that.
And we started playing at the one local shop. And then when they wound up closing, we just what other shops are there in town? And we basically went to the next, we did the same thing at the next one. So, and once that place we were having, I can't remember even why we left there, but we went to the third one for the same exact reason. It was just, you just talk to the owners, and number one, store owners almost never care if you just show up to play with friends, as long as you're not being disruptive and you're buying a few things, and that you can just force a Commander night. I think I would imagine if you are going to show up regularly with friends and they're not doing something already, they will see the opportunity and work with you to get something started.
Exactly, because the more people they can get in their store, the better off they are, because they can start registering you when actual gameplay comes up, so they can get more product in and everything else. Just how the whole game store system works. So,
So I think Kevin had one more question here.
Yes, he did. Kevin also asks, how often do you put together a deck just to take it apart? He says that he's heard about Max's Dramoka and Brago decks, which both suck horribly. My Mogus deck, which is the best deck ever made. And then Dana's decks like Glissa, which he doesn't run enough basic lands. And then Kedis and Crom. I'm curious about Kedis and Crom, Dana, because you talk more about your other decks. So he must really like the Kedis and Crom deck. And then he wants to know if we make just random decks and scrap them often, or do we stick with the tried and true until a new legend comes out that we like?
So first I'll enter, Chris, the Kedis and Crom deck works way better than you would think it would.
Does it really?
Yes.
It's
so silly.
I've never played against it, so.
So I'm running a bunch of the red equivalent of giant growths. So like the things that give a creature +3/+3 or +4/+0 or whatever it is, because there's a handful of those.
Like Titan strength and stuff
exactly.
like that. Yeah.
Yep. So I have a bunch of those, and then I have a bunch of things that copy spells. And then there's also a handful of red things that double the damage that a creature would deal to end a turn, or like grant double strike at instant speed or something. So it's almost all combat tricks where I swing with Crom. I'll put Kedis out, swing with Crom, and then hit him with like giant strength, and then hit him with something that doubles the damage, and then copy that. So then all of a sudden Crom goes from dealing 4 to 8 to 16 to 32, and then Kedis is spraying it to everybody else.
Okay. Are you playing like Zada and all that too, where you can like double the spells that you're casting on them? And
nope. Because then I got to target Zada with stuff, and it's too easy to remove to remove her. And so it doesn't do anything else. It's easier just to have it done. Just do it all through Crom, and have Kedis be the one that spreads the love around. So
well, when you come and play with me in person again, the first thing I'm going to say is I want to see this Kedis and Crom deck. That's the first one I want to play against, because I want to see how it works.
So to answer the question, I guess, and I will answer first and throw back to Max and Chris here. I don't build decks with the intention of taking them apart. Some people do. Like they say, I want to try this thing out, and they try it, and then they know they're not going to play it forever, and they stop.
Dana, there's one that you built that was like that.
Which one was that?
It was your Pyromancer pinging deck.
Yes, yeah. And I shouldn't say I don't, because I've done that on occasion. I knew my Arvid the Cursed deck wasn't going to last. I just wanted to try it out. I thought it would be funny. So occasionally, I guess I do. But like for the most part, when I put a deck together, my goal is to have it be a deck I'm going to keep long term. And I don't usually build a deck on a whim either. I'll like build it on whatever deck building app I'm using, and Goldfish, a bunch of hands, and then I'll think about it. Like I don't like build it right away. It'll sit around for a month or 2 or 3 or 6 sometimes while I like just ponder whether or not I like it and whether I want to tweak and what it would take to be happy with it. So it's a long process before I usually even make a paper copy of the deck. So at that point, I've junked, like by the time a deck gets to that point, I've deleted 5 other ones or 10 other ones that I've like thrown together just to kind of experiment with. And be like, no, that doesn't do what I want to do, or that doesn't seem right. So when one gets to the point where I put it on paper, I've already kind of got to the point where I've scrapped them and taken them apart. And then I still do junk them on occasion. Like I'll make one and like, okay, I thought it was going to work, but it just didn't, or it causes some kind of a problem, and I do take it apart. But generally speaking, once they get to paper, they stay as a deck. I would say 3 out of 4 by the time they get to that point. Like last year, I made 4 new decks and I kept 3 of them. Mm-hmm. I've made 2 already this year, and I'm probably going to keep both of them. I think they feel like I'm going to. So,
oh boy,
so that's me. How about you, Max?
I am the complete opposite. I don't brew decks pretty much in general. Like it takes a lot for me to put a new deck together, so I don't just put stuff together to take it apart. Even if it's like in Architect, I don't even really take the time to sketch something out. I pretty much know if I'm going to go forward with the idea or not in my head. Like, hey, I really want to do an Enchantress deck. I did that with Tuvasa. Done. I knew what I wanted, and I moved forward. I don't sit here and look at like the call time spoilers and be like, I kind of want to build I think I could build Raideen, and the thought just stops there because, like, no, I'm not going to follow through with that. I mean, I've had my Golgari Elves list up on Architect since December, and I have a chunk of the cards literally sitting in front of me in a deck box, and I just haven't followed through. So like I'm probably out of all three of us the guy that keeps his decks once they're built and don't take them apart unless they are complete and utter failures in my eyes. So like my Tajik deck just got ripped apart because that was Boros from 6 years ago when Boros wasn't good.
Sure.
But yeah, I definitely do not spend my free time going, hey, what would this deck look like? That's not the type of player I am. I would rather just get handed a deck to play versus sitting there and taking the time to brew it myself.
How about you, Chris?
Let's see. I just wrote these down off the top of my head on my pen and paper over here. So, back when we first started playing, I used to come with a new deck like every 2 weeks.
You did.
You did.
Yeah.
Yep. And here's just some, like a few of the random decks I built, like Nath of the Gilt Leaf, Narset, Enlightened Master, whatever she is, the everyone hated on me, even though I told you guys it wasn't a bad deck.
The hexproof one?
Yeah. Ural, Brimaz, and I have my Sliver deck. And those are just ones off the top of my head that I know that I've scrapped out. A lot of them were bad. Ural and Slivers were both really good decks. They just became boring or too overpowered, so I just kind of scrapped them out because it wasn't quite the same, deck. It was like the same deck every time you played it. You didn't like it. People hated you for playing it, so I stopped playing them. But usually I try to keep a deck together, and I have lists of a lot of these decks written down, so I could rebuild them if I chose to. I love brewing the decks. Now, actually putting them together is another thing, because I hate sleeving decks, because I do it so much for modern re-sleeving and everything. I'm just like, ugh. So I hate sleeving decks. So usually they just sit there, a pile of cards, and then one day I'm just like, okay, here we go, let's do this. And then I'll put it together. Because as of currently right now, I'm working on an Angels deck that I've told you guys about, and I have I think I'm at like 45 creatures now in the deck. I have a mass list of things that I'm trying to cut it right now. So it's not as easy as it sounds. Dana makes it sound super easy to do this online, but for me, it's actually a nightmare because there's so many cards and I love them all, but I just don't own them.
Well, like, for example, looking at my Archdeck list right now, I have all my decks that are public, but I have a folder called Test Decks that right now has 7 decks that are hidden so people can't see them, that I'm like in various stages of testing out.
Okay.
One of them has a date of June 18th of 2020, so it's 9 months old, that I'm still pondering, that I'm still like tinkering with now and then, which will be Anax hardened in the Forge.
Okay.
So like there's one that's 9 months old I've been messing with, trying to figure out what configuration I want that I have not even put together yet. It may never do. I might delete it if I can't crack it, but like it's close enough that I want to mess around with it more. It's like that's how long I tend to take. Okay, so up next we have a question here from Dylan Haynes. Regarding deck synergy, I found myself in a predicament where I buy part of a list that budget allows for and then feel the deck isn't fully there. Is it sometimes better to find a plan B path of victory from lower priced cards instead of trying to find higher CMC substitutes of the list's main strategy that are within your budget? So would you rather find another way to win or just find substitutions, essentially, is what he's asking if you are playing on a tight budget?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah, it's also getting a little bit tricky, I think, for me to really speak to this, because I'm lucky enough that like when I started playing at this point like 7 years ago, I picked up a lot of cards that nowadays are no longer budget, but they weren't really bad 7 years ago. So it's I think we mentioned this when we talked about Proxy's last show, where I talked about Tithe being a card that we used to just casually talk about throwing it in a white deck.
Yep.
That's I've got like 4 or 5 copies of Tithe that aren't even in decks, let alone ones that I do have in decks, because I found them in collections or like flipping through a dollar bin somewhere, and I'm like, I always want Tithe for a white deck. I'm going to buy this for the $1 they're asking for it. So I'm lucky enough to be in a position I don't oftentimes have to deal with that decision-making conundrum there. So I'm probably not the best person to necessarily answer that. And honestly, to talk about proxies again, really, if your group is playing at a high power level and you can't afford to play at that high power level, I'm okay with that. If you want to proxy up something, now I think like use your head about it. Like, I don't think you need to proxy 10 dual lands for your 5-color deck necessarily if people aren't playing at that perfect power level. But like, if everyone's playing that perfectly tuned Korvald list or that perfectly tuned Chulane list in your meta and you just can't afford to do it, they probably would rather play against a deck of the same power level with some proxies than just beat you up every week too. So like that's also an alternative, I would say, to consider, particularly if everyone around you is playing at a level that you can't compete with.
Oh, I agree with that. I know that there are guys in our shop who play CDH, and they love it. And they actually allow proxies in there so they can get more people to play CEDH with them.
Right. Like the games are worse if people don't proxy a lot of times in those situations.
Yep. Personally, for me, I would look for cards that are similar within the budget. The other thing to think about, and I've been doing this a lot lately, if you find damaged cards, water damage, bent, sure. For instance, there was a story that I can tell you where Dana beat me in the door of our local LGS by like 3 seconds to buy a tropical island that had a bend through it for extremely cheap. I mean, if you can find that stuff for really cheap, you're not playing a competitive format. And if you double sleeve your cards, like if you perfect fit it and then sleeve it with something else, usually you can't tell that the card's damaged. So you can't have a feeling or anything. So go that route too. That could be something to look at. Unless you really want to keep your value of your collection, then, you got to figure something else out. But
I actually saw something on that regard, Chris, recently. Somebody was talking about buying water damaged cards like that, and they had it was somebody who owned a comic book store, / game store, and they had something they called a comic press, which was like a big, almost like a industrial press for like pressing down comic books that were trying to get like warped, and they would use that industrial press on curved foils and on water damaged cards.
Really?
Just to flatten them out and then have them be sleeve playable. And it was like, this card was like, looks like this. And the guy would hold up, it was on a YouTube video, hold up a picture of the card and it's all wavy. And he put it in the press and jack the press down for 30 seconds and lift it up. And this water damaged card still is water damage. It still looks visually, you can tell, but it's like perfectly wafer flat now.
Huh. That's interesting.
So if your store has... So if you have a comic store near you that has that kind of thing, that's also an option to clean up water damaged cards just to make them sleeve playable.
Yeah, I mean, anything damage based, because a lot of times the LGS is looking to sell them anyways, and they'll sell them for super cheap. I mean, I know when I'm buying stuff for like Modern or whatnot, I'll go through the stack of the cards and the one that's in the worst shape or whatever, for like a $70 card, I'm like, I need that one because I need it for play, and it's still sleeve playable. So it's the best way to go.
How about you, Max? What do you do in those situations?
Oof, this is tough because I kind of agree with you, Dana. I've started playing long enough ago where some of these cards that are no longer cheap, are $20 to $30. But I have copies. I guess as personally speaking, I would probably find monetarily cheaper versions for substitutes if you can't afford that Smothering Tithe. Granted, nothing really replaces Smothering Tithe, but I would find another card that's cheaper for my budget money-wise to put into the deck, and maybe just start, putting a couple bucks aside every week to go get that card or those 10 cards you need. It isn't something where you need to have this deck ready to go unless it's for like some weird streaming event or something, tomorrow. Just slowly work your way to that final idea. If you build your decks on Archideck, you have the version you want that deck to be, and then you make a copy of it, and then this is the current living version, and you just work your way to that final version of the deck that you really want it to be. Yep. Whether that's with that Smothering Tithe or with that Grave Pact or something like that, because I also think a part of this falls into what is the deck trying to do. If you're trying to do Aristocrats, Dictator, Erebos, and Grave Pact are, expensive cards again.
Right.
You kind of need those if you want to do that type of aristocrat build. Or, you could run Tegrid or something. So, but if you're just trying to build maybe mono green Stompy, there's a lot of really cheap green creatures that have trample. Like, there you go.
And it's easy to also, do a combination of those things. Like, if you've always wanted to play Angus Mackenzie, some kind of Turbo Fog deck, I mean, people probably will be cool with you proxying up that Angus because it's a crazy expensive commander. And maybe instead of running Tithe, you can run Gift of Estates as a cheaper substitute for that Tithe until you can get a Tithe, or maybe it's just good enough. Like, you can find ways to work or to do all of those things simultaneously if it gets you there.
Yep.
People just generally want to play. So, like, whatever gets you to the point where you can play, people usually are cool with that.
Another thing to keep in mind, and granted, it is still the season of COVID and whatnot, but this is a trading card game.
Yeah.
So trading cards, like, because there's probably someone out there, they set out their binder, they may have, a $500 card in there, and they're willing to trade these cards, and they look through your binder and they're like, oh, well, I need like these $400 cards or whatever, I'm willing to trade this card for those if you're willing to trade them. I mean, I've done that with numerous people where, you can make a really, really good trade for something that they really need for something that they don't need in their binder. So,
yeah, I mean, even just small goofy stuff, you'd be surprised how many times like that Modern player needs that Manamorphose that you happen to have left over. And hey, they've got this card that they don't need for Commander that's, also a $7 card, and that just works out for everybody.
Yep.
So We have one more question here from Dylan. If I shut down the current leader of the table, it helps the whole board, and that's great. But it seems like it immediately lets my opponents get back to their strategies, putting me on a dartboard and opening me up to more threats than the one I just shut down. Do you guys find yourselves waiting for someone else to do it? And he would like tips we have on how to be the hero of the moment and save the day versus helping too many people, which can inadvertently hurt you down the road.
I sit back and laugh. That's what I do.
Well, and it's really tricky because it helps. It's a whole different thing depending on who you're playing with. Like the people at the table with you might respond differently from one pod to the next to the exact same situation. So to give you an example, if you Dylan were to sit down with Max and Chris and I in a pod, how we generally respond is if someone's leading, everyone kind of focuses that person and knocks them back down to no longer being leading, and then somebody else steps forward and everyone hits that person. Like, that's usually how we play whenever I've been in games with the three of us. And most of the people around our shop that we play with have always traditionally kind of done the same thing. We also don't see a ton of combo necessarily either, so there aren't people that kind of win out of nowhere. People need to get that lead to try to win the game, so it becomes that kind of whack-a-mole situation where you're just trying to keep the person from getting the lead.
Yep.
But if your playgroup isn't doing that, if like people aren't going to hit the leader, if their response to somebody playing Ginger Taxis is to play 2 Ginger Taxises, or the equivalent of that, instead of removing it, then that changes everything. And so it's really tough to give advice on this situation because it's so fluid. I don't know. Do you guys have any specific thoughts on this, Max?
Yeah, so I think you hit a couple great points there. I think it kind of depends on who you play with and how often. So, like, I know if I were playing with Dana and Chris and, say, Dr. Mike, we've played together long enough to know all of our, like, tells, essentially. And Dana's tells, we know what they're probably going to do. Like, Max hasn't cast anything for 6 turns, and he has all his mana. He probably has board wipes. Like, Dana has said that countless times on this show. But, I agree with what Dana said. We also play to where we want the game to go long enough so everybody can kind of do their thing. So instead of taking out the entire table at once, you knock that person in the lead down to the same level as everybody. And I guess that's kind of more like of an unspoken alliance we've kind of made as a play group. Like, that's just how we all have kind of played for the last X years that we've been playing together. But for me specifically, I think it kind of comes down to how you deal with the leader versus the entire table. So, like, if casting a Wrath of God is going to destroy one of your creatures, 2 of another person, 3 of another person, but it's going to take out, 10 or 12 of the person you're calling the leader, I feel like the other 2 players are going to be okay losing 2 to 3 things if you took out the board that's going to kill everybody next turn. And I also think the opposite could be said if you're ready to take out the leader, but you might be able to take out the entire table, do it. It kind of goes back to that question we ended on last week of when do you kill someone? If I'm playing Tuvasa, I might just strategically play the cards I've drawn to where I know, okay, I have Tuvasa out, it's equipped up with a bunch of auras, and I just drew Finest Hour, so I can take 2 combat steps. Oh, that means I can take out Dana because he's the leader, and I can also take out Chris because he's probably my next biggest threat, and I can deal with player 3. They don't have enough anything going on. They probably won't hit me on the crackback. So I think there's a point in the game where helping the table is great, and you got to use some politics. So, hey guys, I can take care of that, but don't swing at me, or, you brought that up the other night, Chris.
I did. But, I put that in Slack.
Chris has been holding that grudge for 6 years.
Yeah. And then there's other times where you just say, you know what, I can take out the leader and I can take out player 2, and that just leaves me with player 3 to deal with in a turn, because what I'm going to do, they have 1 creature out, I'm at 40 life, they're at 20, I doubt they're going to get anywhere, in a turn. That's my view on it.
Interesting.
I think the one general piece of advice I would offer in this regard that I think applies is people in Commander tend to jump the gun regarding priority to deal with a troublesome target. So, the first player resolves a doubling season and something bad is going to happen because they have mana free, and you're like, here comes that Planeswalker that's going to auto-ult. You immediately Beast Within it or something before they can play the Planeswalker. You should not jump the queue there and give the other 2 people, assuming you're 4th in line, give the other 2 players a chance to remove it before you jump ahead, because there's definitely been times someone's done that to me where like I've been the first person with removal priority on, whatever that target is, and I was going to blow it up before something could happen. And then someone who's like, 2 people away from me goes, "Oh, I'm going to blow that up." I'm like, okay. I don't say anything about that, but like people in Commander sometimes do jump that queue, and I would say try to avoid doing that, because that's a good way to wind up with no spells left in hand, because you've been the person that solved problems. Even if other people are willing to do it, you just like jumped the gun and did it before they had a chance to.
Yes.
Okay, so our next questions come from Andrew. His first question is, what 3-mana ramp spells are you still running, or have you completely moved to the 2-mana ramp?
Well, green's the worst color in Magic, so who plays ramp spells anyways?
Wow. So for me personally, in green, I still run all the 3-mana spells, your Kadama's Reaches, your Cultivates. I also prefer kind of some of the more 4 or 5-mana spells, like Promise of Tomorrow. That's the wrong promise. The green one that lets you get any 2 lands into play tapped. Or at 4 mana is Pier's Whim. But those cards also, like Pier's Whim, deals with problems and gets me a land. So it's kind of a somewhat modular spell, I would say. And then Hour of Promise, that's the one. There we go. It just gets me 2 lands. I don't care about the Desert Clause to make the token, but it gets me any 2 lands. For artifacts, I still run Commander Sphere. I mean, it taps for any color and it draws a card at any time, because you don't need to tap it to draw the card. But yeah, 2-mana ramp is great. The reprint of 3 Visits and the reprint of Arcane Signet in Commander Legends helped a bunch of my decks, just because I had access to those cards that I didn't have access to 6 months ago, a year ago, or whatever. Sure. But I also think I'm the type of guy that likes to play a more slower paced deck, so I don't really mind taking turn 3 to play a Commander Sphere or a Cultivate, where other players want to be doing something maybe more impactful on turn 3. But that's just who I am.
I think this comes down to, honestly, the power level of decks. Like, if you want to keep your deck within the power, 6 to 7 range, you're going to cast more of the 3 and 4 mana spells. Now, if you're going up, from 7, 8, and 9, you're going to be casting the 2 1 mana spells, those types of spells. So I guess that's where I would come in with it. If I were to play green, I would be more inclined to be like Max and playing the 3 and 4 mana spells, because you get more value for the spell compared to the other ones. Personally, that's the way I see them anyways.
Yeah, I much prefer the 2 mana. I prefer the 2 mana spells. Giving you, turn 4 mana on turn 3 is really nice, and there's strategic reasons to do that I completely get. But like Max said, I'm not playing to win as quickly as possible. I usually want games to go, at least 8 turns, and they almost always go more than that. So I want to be efficient, but like I'm also not in a huge hurry. So I do tend to run 2 mana ramp spells. So if I'm playing green, I'm definitely running Rampant Growth and, Nature's Lore, and now 3 Visits is cheap. Farseek if I'm not in mono green, because it has something I can go fetch. But I am not against running Cultivate or Kadama's Reach if I'm in a deck that, wants those kind of things. I think Skyshroud Claim for 4 mana is still really, really good if you have things you can go grab, particularly dual lands that you can make come into play untapped. As for mana rocks, same thing. I definitely like 2 mana rocks as well. Arcane Signet, glad to see that added to the stable of things. We got the other half of the Talisman cycle. That's nice to have access to, obviously Signets. But if I have to choose between a really, really good utility 3 mana rock, like say Midnight Clock, that can, wheel me after 3 turns, or in a token deck, Heraldic Banner, it's going to turn those 1/1s all into 2/1s or something, I'm not going to run Fratric Power Stone over a Midnight Clock or Heraldic Banner in a deck where that makes sense just because it's a 2 mana rock. Like if the 3 mana rock does a really, really useful thing, and maybe Commander Sphere is enough. Like I still play Commander Sphere too. That's going to be good enough for me to go to that higher power level. I was just talking with somebody on stream last night. I still like Thran Dynamo as a 4 mana rock that taps for 3 mana. You play it for 4, and okay, let's say it's turn 4 and you use all 4 of your mana up. But you still have 3. You can tap it for 3 immediately. That's not a terrible trade-off to then give you access next turn to 7 or 8 mana. I'm perfectly fine doing that because I'm not in that much of a hurry. So while I like the efficiency, I'm absolutely willing to put an Inspiring Statuary in a deck filled with equipment or something because the upside is so huge.
Awesome. So Andrew's next question is, why does every new Simic commander seem to have that extra line of text that pushes it from good to broken? Because it's Simic? Question mark? Like that's that's my answer.
I wonder if they're just trying too hard because all the Simic commanders seem to all be the same. So now they're just pushing them so hard to try to get one that's not, but good, and then they become too
limited
good.
Design space is what you're trying to say? There's Simic is a limited design space area, maybe? Just you either draw cards or do counters.
Yeah, that seems to be what they always are. What's the new one? The Snake or whatever that came out, which kind of doesn't do all that. I mean, it's a different one, but yeah.
Yeah,
although it's still really strong.
It is.
Yeah, making a token and then sacrificing the token to keep your commander alive.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably the one that he's talking about, because that card is pretty stupid. I mean, I can't imagine seeing that as a commander. I mean, if you build around that,
Well, Dana, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think it's complicated. You can offer joke answers that aren't entirely jokes,
right?
So I'll give the answer that's definitely serious first. I think for whatever reason, just the way the color pie works, cards that are really good, or cards and effects that are really good in blue and green in Commander aren't necessarily a problem in Standard. So something like Return of the Wild Speaker or Heroic Intervention or Rishkar's Expertise, for example, are all absolute blowout bomb kind of cards in Commander that made almost no impact on Standard. So the way the color pie in green in particular, I think it works that way in blue as well, there can be cards that are really, really great in Commander that they can put in Standard sets that don't do that. White, on the other hand, cards that are really, really strong in Standard, things like History of Benalia or something, are not remotely good in Commander. So I think number one, Simic is just strong in Commander in part because the cards they designed for Standard that are maybe relatively fair there wind up being super strong in Commander, while as with White, the cards that are strong in Standard aren't strong in Commander. So I think that's why number one Simic is really good, and why by comparison to White looks super weak. However, I will say beyond that, for whatever reason, the team that designs Simic stuff is not afraid to get crazy, and they do it regularly. The comparison I made one time was like, if Boros were your parents and you turned 16, they'd be like, well, here's this 1997 Honda Civic we bought you for $200. Now drive very carefully, Junior. That's the Boros design team when they look at making a card. The Simic design team is the parent whose kid turned 16 and they're like, here's a Lamborghini and an ounce of cocaine. Go have fun. Like, that's how the Simic design works as well. So not only do I think that there's weird color pie stuff that amplifies things, they're just really careful with Boros, and they are insane when it comes to Simic. And they're just like, let's just see what happens. Let's get crazy. So that's my take on those two things. I think it's a combination of those two factors.
Awesome.
This question is a wonderful question. I actually really like this question because I had to reread it like 4 times to be like, okay, that wasn't a typo. Okay, I get this. So Andrew's question is, if you would name a child after a magic character, what would it be? And why Flip Flip?
Fibble Flip.
Fibble Flip. It's the weird changeling dude. I don't know what he is. He's like a 0.
He's a homunculi. He's a homunculi.
Well, have you seen Full Metal Alchemist? Homunculi are not good. They're bad guys. They just need to be destroyed.
We don't know where Fibble Flip lies on the hero to villain spectrum in Magic, so...
That's true. Good point. Well, since Mac is the only childless one here, Max, were you to have a kid, would you choose a magic name? Or would that...
I would, I would try to choose, if I could choose a magic name, I would choose one that isn't popular. So I wouldn't choose Jace or Liliana or Gideon, even though I like the name Gideon because it's in other franchises like Gravity Falls or Criminal Minds.
It is a very good name.
Fibble Flip is a cool name just because I would love to see all the teachers being like, there's no vowels in your name. There's no vowels. Like, what's going on here?
Oh, and now you'd be Elon Musk. Is that what you'd be doing here?
Yeah, exactly.
But I think I would probably pick Calyx first. He was the planeswalker from Theros Beyond Us. Yeah. Just because like you can call the kid Cal. There's some cool stuff you can do with that name. So, and it's unique. So that'd be my choice.
And there are a surprising amount of Magic content creator type people who have children with Magic character names too. It's definitely not
very true.
It's a thing that happens.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Tristan Van Helden asks, what caused you guys to create a podcast? This is also a question Max answered recently on Commander Crunch, and I'll let him do it one more time.
Awesome. So we're gonna try to get through this quickly. So back in the day when we were playing at LGS number 2 and 2.5, we would go downtown. The shop was located in downtown Eau Claire. We would go to this pizza place beforehand because they did like half-price appetizers and half-price beer and rail drinks.
Don't ever order
so we'd
the
all
margarita.
Get together. Never order the 4-foot-tall margarita. We would go there. The group of us, we had about 6 to 8 people every week. We'd sit there and chat about what we would read on MTG Salvation and on Twitter and the Mothership that day, And we're sitting there and our friend Luke Witten's like, we're just doing a podcast without recording anything. And so we're like, yeah, let's try this. And Luke had experience with audio equipment and stuff. So Dana and I started a show called Commander Masterclass, or the CMC. And we did that show for about 34 episodes. And then that ended via creative differences. And then Dana and I just said, we want to keep doing this. So we asked Chris, because he'd been on a couple of episodes of the CMC. Chris was like, heck yeah, let's do it. And then we did some test episodes, and I taught myself how to edit. And here we are on episode 251, where I no longer am the editor. And we've had great editing from our previous editor, and now Rafael Garcia. And we're still going nice and strong.
That's a pretty good summary.
That's a very good summary. I mean, wow. Because I would have taken me much longer, because I would have gone into tangents of other things.
Chris, I've told that story too much in the last 3 weeks.
The one thing I will note as part of that too is at the time we started doing it, it was basically Command Zone, and I think Commanderin was going, and Commander's Brew.
Yeah, there's only a few of them.
About it.
Oh, and Brothers War. I think they were around.
Well, they roughly fired up, though, roughly like the same time we did when we were doing the CMC.
That's right.
And then at that point in time, I think a Legendary Creature kicked off. Like while we were starting off, Brothers War started as a Legendary Creature, as did CCO. Those ones jump out at me as kind of the folks that started roughly the same time we did, but there just wasn't much Commander content compared to today, where there's
hundreds.
Yeah, it definitely seems that way. So that was also part of the reason, because like not only were we kind of doing it and thought it would be fun, but we also were like, well, there's just not much content out there, so let's do it. Whereas today there's just so much. So yeah, that's a pretty good breakdown of how it went, Max.
Thank you.
How many decks do you guys think is too many?
I have a perfect answer for this one.
I have too many right now. I think I have 13. Yeah, I think I'm at 13 right now, and it's probably, that's 5 or 6 too many for me to keep track of appropriately. It's now become challenging to upgrade decks when a new set comes out, and remembering how this one plays versus that one, or like what interaction works well versus this one. At least for me, it's beyond my mental space. I still am going to keep them, I think, but like it's beyond what I should have to play them the way they should be played.
Yep. My answer to this would be, you have too many decks when you don't have enough time to play them all in a month. Because you got to look at it. A good way to look at it is most people play once a week or so, maybe twice a week. And how many games do you get in? 1 to 2 games maybe. So if you have 30 decks, there's no way you're going to be able to play all the decks. Now, if you have like 7 or 8 decks, then definitely you'll be able to play all your decks. And that's the way that I look at it. Another way to look at it is what Dana said is, you lose, your mind trying to figure out how the strategy works. Yeah. So you haven't played this deck in, a month, and you're like, how does this deck work again? So, I mean, once it becomes that tough for you, that's when you have way too many decks.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I agree with the big thing for me is having enough to know you don't forget how to play them. So I currently have, I think, 5 decks put together right now that I know I could pick up. Not playing Regna and Krav for a month, I could pick it up and still remember the basic path to victory with that deck. So that's kind of just my answer is, how like Chris said, how often do you get to play them, and don't forget about it. If this was in the before times with events, it's however many you feel comfortable carrying through a GP hall, because I used to have 8 or 10 decks as well, and lugging 10 decks around a convention hall all weekend is exhausting. So if this were, if events were happening, I tend to only bring 4 decks to a convention, because, it's less on my body just to carry them around all weekend.
That's a really good point.
So Josh writes in and asks, will we be able to issue a challenge to Max's Grum Gully deck over VEDH in the future? So I'm just going to answer this one. Unfortunately, no. And the answer is kind of twofold. First was the original idea for this deck was to take it to events, have people challenge it, and then they get to sign a card in the deck, saying that, hey, I got to play against it. Then COVID happened and there are no events. In that time period, I have assembled a couple decks and, through COVID, and mainly one didn't work out, but it needed a bunch of cards from Grumgully. So Grumgully is sort of in pieces right now, and I don't know if it will be put back together once events start, but I probably will redo that challenge of have our community build me a deck that will be played at events. It just won't be Grumgully.
So you'll just do it with a newer deck or a different deck and have that be the one people can play with. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
That does make sense. Next we hear from James Barnes. And James's question is, what is the definitive must-kill player out of the list of all the people on Slack? And I'm going to answer this question quick because I actually scrolled through Slack and read a whole bunch of comments from people. And for some reason, they got on this topic on their own, and everyone came to an agreement that it was James B. Trigger Miser, who is, that's his, and I'm assuming this is the same exact person who asked the question.
Same exact person,
so
yep.
I have never personally played against you, so I don't have an opinion on it, because if I had an opinion, it's kill Dana first. But
it's not
everyone
me.
else seems to think that it's you, so I don't know. I'd love to hear why they think it's you, because they're all saying that you like kill everybody. Like one comment was, when you're in the game, it's a 3-player game, or the game starts over once you're dead. That's when the actual game starts. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on, but I would love to hear about it.
Who's your pick, Max?
Oofda. So I've played against quite a bit of our community. I think I have 2 people that I would probably kill on sight, try to kill first in a game. One of them is Matthias, just because he brings some bit of power to a pod, and it's always enjoyable to play against him, but it's always a challenge, so I like to take that deck out first. And my second one is going to be Matt with his Naiath deck, because it killed me with an army of squirrels and I don't like it, so now he's just permanently in my black book of revenge. But I love playing against that deck every time I get to play against it.
Nice. I have not had a chance to play with many people. I've played a few. My nights tend to be relatively busy, so I have not got a chance to play as many games as I would like to. I will say of people that I've played with enough to have developed an opinion, Lenny Woolley hits pretty hard. He's always a good person to take out. And Seaburn Visor, I think he's from the southern Wisconsin area. And I've played with him in person a couple times at events. Seeb always brings strong decks and plays them quite well. And I never feel like it's a power mismatch or anything, but I always feel like I have to be on. Like there's no like slacking off or making a lot of misplays, because I'll just get killed if I do. So Seeb is one I always have to keep an eye on, because he comes hard and plays consistent Magic. And when you screw up, you're going to pay the price for it. So he's the other one that jumps to mind.
Makes sense. So James also asks, Azorius tokens is a pretty potent strategy. Is it just lacking a commander, or are the staples from these colors distracting from its strength? Honestly, Azorius is... I've never really thought about it as a token strategy. So my opinion, it's probably that the colors are just, distracting away from its strength. Due to the simple fact that mainly Azorius is meant for your removal, your counter magic, other stuff, big flyers, other beaters. It's not really a token strategy, whereas your greens and other stuff really is what your tokens come from.
Yeah, I think that's nail on the head there with that, Chris. Tokens implies combat damage, usually. Some kind of a combat deck,
yes.
Which Azorius just doesn't lend itself well to finding win conditions with.
No, it doesn't.
There's a few ways. There's an example, Max's Brago deck. Combat wins are tricky in that deck, so Azorius tends, like, combo is just the logical way to do it, because there's just not a lot of ways to go over the top with turning creatures sideways in that kind of deck. That's what's always been the problem with like those Azorius Merfolk or Azorius Bird tribal kind of decks or even Spirits, just like getting that last bit of damage through without, easy access to trample or buffs gets tough. That's why True Conviction's so good. That's why Akroma's Will is so good in white, because it lets you do those combat damage over the top kind of attacks, but there's not a ton of those.
Yeah, I think white is definitely the strength of those two colors, and blue kind of is probably what's holding it back.
Particularly in combat stuff, yeah, you bet. John Egner asks, what is your favorite Ravnica guild and or color pairing? I didn't really realize what my favorite one was or my favorite color pairing at least, until recently. I like Dimir a lot, and I just didn't, didn't realize I liked Dimir a lot, even though I always did. It's only been the last like year or so I've kind of realized I just like playing black-blue. I would have guessed prior to that, I would have probably said Golgari, but I've realized, no, I've just always liked Dimir. The guild isn't anything I'm like super into necessarily. I don't think Dimir is a guild that I have any kind of like identity with necessarily, but as far as color pairings go, I just have a lot of fun playing black-blue.
We know what Max's is. He's an Azorius scumbag, so.
He has a tattoo to prove it.
Right?
I do. I was going to say my two favorite are Azorius and Selesnya. Those would be my two favorite.
Yep. My favorite by far is Rakdos. And probably pushing into my second favorite would be red paired with pretty much anything else. Just the simple fact that I love the color red. I love the mechanics in red and everything else. And all the other colors tend to lend something to them, aside from Boros, because Wizards hates that color combination for some reason. But,
Sure.
I mean, we're getting there slowly but surely.
And then we have a question from John. Also, do any of your decks not in your favorite guild color include themes and strategies from those guilds? So Max's Dromoka deck seems to have some control elements in it, and there's some Azorius elements in his Selesnya deck, that kind of thing. That's a really interesting question. Maybe, I do like to tend to play like kind of old, weird, obscure cards, and that feels pretty Dimir to me. I do like to kind of be tricky and catch people off guard with stuff, and that feels pretty much Dimir, even in colors that aren't Dimir.
Artifacts is the big thing I see coming from you, and Dimir seems to be a good color combination for artifact type decks.
Yeah, I do a good bit of that. Dimir does a lot of stuff where it like tries to be really efficient with how it plays, and I just tend to do that with all of my decks. So I think there's definitely an element of that for sure for me. How about you, Chris?
Well, all my decks have Rakdos in them as of right now, so I mean, I can't really just say anything about that. I just kind of get stuck into that lump anyways.
Yeah, no, I see that. How about you, Max?
I don't know. So, like John said, Dromoka has a lot of control with, like, board wipes or targeted removal. Brago kind of does the same thing because he has counter spells, but, like, I look at, say, Regna and Krov. That's a Orzhov deck. And is Orzhov known for tokens? Because when I think about tokens in like EDH, I think about Selesnya or like Naya.
I think of tokens when I think of Orzhov, just due to like the recent standard format.
The aristocrats and
a lot of spirit kind of stuff too.
So I mean, maybe I guess I've never really thought about it like this. If my decks use other elements from other decks in them. I guess they do, just because it's my playstyle. Like, I like to control the game a little bit, so I'm going to build in some board wipes or some form of counter magic if I can, if I'm playing blue something, or in black-white, I run a lot of board wipes. Yeah, well, it's weird to think about.
Now I'm wondering if I shouldn't get the Dimir guild symbol tattooed for my next tattoo. I'm like,
there you go.
I hadn't thought about it until just now. And I'm like, that might actually be kind of a cool tattoo. So maybe once I can go back to tattoo places safely, that's maybe where I'll go next.
Well, heck yeah.
Okay. So that is going to wrap it up because John's final question is, thank you for 250 episodes, for being awesome community ambassadors, and for answering my questions. You are welcome, John, and thanks to you and for all the listeners for showing up here for 250 of these.
For sure. Thank you, everybody who tunes in every week and sometimes twice a week.
Yeah, I love these question episodes because I don't really get on Slack too much, so this is where I get to kind of interact with the community a little bit, so these are awesome. Keep asking away with them, because I guarantee we'll have another episode coming in the future where we answer more questions.
We definitely will. Okay, that is going to wrap up episode 251. I'm Dana. You can find me on Twitter at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDRCentral_Max, and you can find Chris at WiseSquishy1. Our show was edited by Rafael Garcia. You can find him at Ursa Bearwalker, and our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons. We will be back next week. Until then, I am Dana.
I'm Max.
And I'm Chris.